Hello everyone, welcome to Mr. Noctory, boring ancient history stories for sleep. Tonight we're diving into the strangest beauty trends in ancient history across 12 civilizations. 3,000 years before the Common Era, Egypt was a place where beauty wasn't just to attract men, but to please the god Ra. Cleopatra and Nefertiti smeared clay, crocodile gut enzymes, bathed in donkey milk, wrapped their faces in gold. 500 years before the Common Era, Greek women believed skin must be white as marble, lips pale purple, like a melancholy sunset, and breasts, the smaller, the classier. They bleached their teeth with fermented urine. Beauty standard? Pale as death, long hair, fingernails like willow leaves, and silence. That was ancient China. Before we begin, if you truly find this a comforting place to hide away at night, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. Like the rules in an old tavern, only if you need a quiet corner. And you know what I love most? Reading the comments, seeing where you're from and what time it is. Whether it's New York or Norway, 1 in the morning or 5 in the morning, you're still here. And I see you. Now dim the lights. Turn on a little fan if you have one. Not because it's hot, but for the soft buzzing sound. You open your eyes. In front of you is a cracked desert and walls made of sun-dried mud bricks. The air is so dry, it feels like your skin might crack too. The scent of hot earth and burning temple oil drifts from afar. Slow drums echo from an early morning ritual. You're in Uruk, the capital of sun and dust. And today is a major day, the first harvest sacrifice. You wouldn't dare leave home without eyeliner. Not because you're afraid of looking bad, but because you're afraid of being seen with a naked face before the gods. Welcome to Mesopotamia, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, where humans had just learned how to grow rice and already learned how to line their eyes. Here, beauty didn't come from Paris. It came from the god Enki and dreams of the Euphrates River. These early Uruk citizens invented writing, the wheel, and makeup. Specifically, coal, a pitch-black blend of charcoal, crushed metals, and oil. Their coal pots weren't tubes or compacts. They were carved limestone jars, engraved with palm leaf motifs, filled with powder as black as a starless night. The eyeliner brush, a shaved reed, slightly bent, like a tiny spoon for the gods. When dipped in coal, the tip would tremble, like the heartbeat of someone praying in the mirror. They lined their eyes as if ready to shoot a desert rock ballad. But wait, don't think they did this to look sexy. No, they painted their eyes to ward off evil spirits and block out the sun. They believed the dark lines weakened demons and protected against glare. Of course, not all coal was the same. The rich used finely ground minerals mixed with rose oil from Akkad. The poor, fireplace ash or black clay mixed with well water, cheap and spirit repellent, according to priests. Some mothers even lined their babies' eyes, not to make them cute, but to prevent them from being lured away by the sand ghost. To them, a single circle of eyeliner could keep a child alive one more day. Because yes, Mesopotamia had 2 weather settings, hot and extra hot. What about men? Oh, they didn't skip out on beauty. Mesopotamian men had their own standards, and it lived in their beards. Beards weren't just facial hair. They were power, astronomy, and sometimes existential dread. Beards came in layers, in waves. Some scribes said wealthy men could spend over an hour a day grooming their beards based on Jupiter's cycles. The more the beard curled in the right direction, the more it proved you had virtue. and a sense of calendars. They were facial hair artists. Their beards, long, thick, carefully curled with plant wax, looked like a solar system diagram. Every wave of hair could represent a god, or at least a kind of respect for the cosmos. They didn't shave. They nurtured their beards like one nurtures faith. A beautiful beard declared, "I understand the order of the universe, and I have essential oils." You wake up on a morning in Your first act isn't brushing your teeth, no toothbrush yet, but scooping black coal from a limestone jar, catching your reflection in well water, and lining your eyes carefully, because if your hand slips, Goddess Ishtar might take offense. You never had a selfie camera, but you always knew someone or something was watching. In Mesopotamia, beauty was a spiritual defense. It wasn't about attraction. It was about facing the unseen. And if today you put on makeup to feel stronger, know that you're joined by a 4,000-year-old soul sitting somewhere in the wind, with black-lined eyes and curly beard, softly stroked by desert air, like an ancient poem. You're standing in a bright limestone room. Sunlight filters through linen curtains, shining on a portrait, a long face, straight nose, and crescent moon eyes rimmed in black. You're not in a spa. You're in ancient Egypt, around 1,200 years before the Common Era. And what people put on their faces is not for the faint of heart. Egyptians didn't just love beauty, they worshipped it. Beauty wasn't for admiration, but for earning existence in the world of the gods. That's why, from Queen Cleopatra to an ordinary stonecutter, everyone could name 7 skin oils, 3 eyeliner styles, and 2 donkey milk bath recipes. Yes, donkey milk. Their mirrors weren't glass, but polished bronze, reflecting not the face, but the soul. Cosmetic boxes made of ebony, carved with the eye of Horus, both decoration and protection. Coal brushes made of ivory, with ceremonial-only sets kept separate. Every beauty item, from containers to scents, was not just for appearance, but to send signals to the afterlife. Cleopatra, the most iconic queen, bathed daily in warm milk from over 700 donkeys, mixed with honey and white lotus. Nefertiti, whose face still lives on in sculpture, used red clay from the eastern desert, crocodile gut enzymes, and a type of fragrant mud that smelled faintly like funerals. You heard right. Crocodile dung, thick, warm, enzyme-rich, was used to exfoliate and treat acne. Some believed it made the skin glow and the soul stick around. But not everyone had the right to smell good. The poor burned tree resin in their hair to absorb the scent. They mimicked noble fragrances, because in ancient Egypt, body odor was class. To smell good was to have land, servants, and a pure lifestyle. If you didn't, you were just a walking corpse, waiting for Anubis to pass judgment. Think charcoal masks are extreme. They applied animal innards to skin, believing beauty might help you last into the next life. Because in ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't a moment. It was preparation for death. When you died, you were embalmed. But not everyone got to be beautifully embalmed. They believed the soul would return to see its own body, and so the dead were also made up. Wealthy ladies had lips painted red with resin, eyes lined dark again, and even pink blush added, so their spirit, upon return, would recognize itself and not flee from shame. Some mummies even had perfume placed in their hand, a final promise. Even in death, I'll smell better than my neighbors. So if you weren't beautiful in life, at least your corpse shouldn't be messy. That's why the most precious perfumes, from myrrh, iris flower, dried orange blossoms, were used on the dead. You've never worn a perfume more expensive than your electric bill. They used funeral perfume as a kind of passport to the next world. Ever put on makeup to feel confident at a party? Egyptians wore it to feel confident when facing soul judgment. The black coal wasn't for flirting, it was for meeting Anubis with a steady gaze. So if today you still keep a little eye cream, a soft lip tint just to say, I'm okay, know that you're standing in a long line of people, that Egyptian girl who once powdered her cheeks on a quiet afternoon just to see herself clearer in chaos. She had no Instagram, no filters, no fire in the comments, but she had a dim bronze mirror and a small hope. If I'm beautiful today, maybe tomorrow, I won't be forgotten. She once smeared crocodile dung on her face, just to be seen by the gods as beautiful enough to exist. A sea breeze brushes past the marble balcony. A small room, white walls, window opening toward the Parthenon. Inside that room, a girl is sitting. No jewelry, no lipstick. On the wooden table are a porcelain powder box and a jar of olive oil. Outside, the faint sound of a lyre, probably from a speech happening in the Agora Square. She hears it, but doesn't take her eyes off the bronze mirror. Do you see her? Not a goddess, just an ordinary person, trying to look like she's not trying. A girl sits by the window frame, her skin so pale it seems to be melting into the sky. She doesn't smile, not out of pride, but because a smile shows wrinkles. You're in Athens, 5th century before Christ, and here the ideal of beauty doesn't make a sound. To be considered beautiful, an ancient Greek woman had to have skin pale like she just woke up from a fever, a small chest, narrow shoulders, and a gait so light it seemed she didn't belong to this world. No highlighter, no plump lips, no confidence is sexy. You think clean girl aesthetic was invented by TikTok? Athenians were doing it 2,500 years ago. No mascara, no contour, just a face that looks freshly awakened. But awakened in philosophy, not after a Netflix binge. She mixes vinegar with lead powder. You use anti-aging serum, both exhausted from trying to look like we're not trying at all. Here, beauty must be silent, humble, and slightly uncomfortable. You ask why the skin had to be that pale? Because sun-kissed skin, meaning a woman had to work under the sun, was not elegant. Only those who lived behind linen curtains, fanned by servants with palm leaves, had skin that had never met the sun. To achieve that, they used a mixture of lead powder and vinegar. That fine dust-like mixture, seemingly harmless, could actually corrode skin, cause dizziness, even hair loss. But they still applied it, because beauty wasn't health. Beauty was looking like you'd just woken from a philosophical dream and had never known what fatigue was. You used 2 layers of cushion foundation. They used 3 layers of poisonous lead. The difference? They didn't have sunscreen or Google to check ingredients. Every morning, they applied a thin layer, then another, until their skin looked like the Parthenon's walls at noon. And the small chest, because in ancient Greek culture, a large chest was seen as lustful, lacking control, something belonging to others. But a small chest was intellect, reason, and chastity, like Athena, the goddess of wisdom, who never called you past midnight. The most beautiful woman was one who was silent, pale, pure as an idea, like a block of marble yet to be carved. Statues of goddesses were the ultimate symbols of Greek beauty. But remember, Those statues didn't speak, didn't breathe, didn't move. They were sculpted to be eternal, so they wouldn't get fat, wouldn't age, wouldn't live. And strangely, that was the ideal. The most beautiful woman was the one closest to a state untouched by time. Almost a memory, not a human being. They didn't take selfies, no filters. But they had one engraved principle. Don't let anyone know you're trying to be beautiful. Everything had to seem accidental. Skin pale like mist, hair soft as night, eyes not too bright, because a strong gaze belonged to men. Have you ever tried to appear elegant? Sat quietly at a party, spoke little, just to not seem too loud? If so, then you and that Athenian girl, mixing lead powder with olive oil in a dimly lit room, once stood on the same frequency of history. Here, beauty does not speak. It whispers through lowered eyes, through soft shoulders, through pale skin that, when night falls, looks like a soul waiting to be called by name. If you think only women suffered for beauty, this was a place where gentlemen applied olive oil to their biceps with the same passion you apply your night cream. Here, beards weren't just beards, they were declarations, they were poetry, they were a measure of intellect, they were also moral and political symbols. Socrates' beard was mocked for being too messy, implying he was too free, too unreliable. A philosopher was once excluded from the council because he was suspected of dyeing his beard black to look younger. In that world, a fake beard was a public lie, and no one wanted to be caught lying with their face. A proper beard had to be soft, black, shaped neatly along the jawline, and combed with a special wooden brush. They said there were only two things a man must protect: his honor and his beard. You thought they were lazy about grooming. Some even had personal barbers. Each morning, after cold water baths, they would sit upright, as if preparing to give a speech, and the barber would trim every strand of beard to look like he's read Aristotle, but isn't smug about it. And olive oil? Not just for cooking. It was rubbed onto the entire body after exercise, so that muscles glistened under the agora sun. The body became a living sculpture, only missing the pedestal. Of course, not everyone was beautiful, but in a society that worshipped ideals, even the effort to get close to beauty was a kind of virtue. So if today you feel a little tired grooming your hair, shaving, or choosing the right styling wax, remember, you're standing shoulder to shoulder with ancient philosophers who once oiled themselves to talk about the immortal soul. They knew they could never look like the god Apollo, but they still brushed their beards, oiled their skin, trimmed their hair, as a gentle statement, I am a man of order. Because in a world of words, where everyone debates essence and truth, sometimes the only thing that makes you heard is the image you leave behind in silence. If Athens whispered beauty through lead powder and olive oil, Sparta screamed it at your face with a spear. No powder, no lipstick, no jasmine-scented perfumes. Here, body odor wasn't something to hide. It was a survival certificate. Spartans believed a warrior's sweat had sacred scent, the smell of training, of wounds, of loyalty. Some even kept their ex-lover's armor just because his sweat reminded them of glory. You used Dior perfume. They used the scent of victory. Only sweat, dust, scars, and a terrifying silence. Here, beauty wasn't in the skin. It was in strength, in legs that could run 20 kilometers without stopping, in an unblinking gaze when hearing the news of a lover's death in battle. Before every battle, Spartan soldiers had a solemn ritual. They combed their hair, each strand pulled back by bare hands, braided neatly as if preparing for a wedding. Some even smeared animal blood on their foreheads, a vow of survival. Not superstition, but a way to say, I'm ready to become part of legend. You're in Sparta, 5th century before Christ, where 7-year-old boys were taken to military camps and taught that hunger is a necessary feeling. From birth, Spartan infants were physically inspected. If the body was weak, deformed, or unworthy to fight, the child would be taken outside the city and left in the woods. Here, ugly, unworthy to live. No one said it out loud, but every surviving child understood one truth. To be seen, you had to be beautiful. And in Sparta, beautiful meant strong enough not to be discarded. Where a 14-year-old girl was called pretty if she could beat a boy her age in wrestling. The ideal beauty, a body with no excess fat, broad shoulders, thighs hard as bronze, scars not from falling, but from fighting. And if you were a man, you were most beautiful when you died for an ideal. No one cared what shade your lips were. They only asked, did you fall beautifully? Seriously, dying for Sparta was considered the final performance. You had to fall in the right posture, on cue, without a scream. A beautiful death was a beauty that needed no proof. Spartan women were unlike any others. Elsewhere, a beautiful woman was quiet, still, and smiled softly. In Sparta, beauty meant running faster, lifting stone weights, shouting victory chants while giving birth. Their beauty came from strength, because they were the ones creating new warriors for the nation. The stronger the woman, the stronger the country. So the beauty of a Spartan woman wasn't in curves, it was in abs and steady knees. They wore short dresses, they cut their hair short. They weren't expected to be gentle. They were trained to give birth, then send their sons to war without crying. The common love confession back then. You have sturdy ankles. You ever felt stressed because you forgot to wax your legs? They were stressed about bathing in cold water every morning, with bare hands, while reciting ancient warrior poems. You chose a push-up bra. They chose leather belts to keep their spines straight as a sword. Sparta had no cosmetics, but they had something stronger, an ideal, something that turned your body into a symbol. No lipstick needed, just endurance. And you, in those sleepy mornings, pulling your shirt to cover the dark circles under your eyes. Maybe you never thought of this, that the desire to be beautiful, whether through powder, through muscle, or through silence, has always been a way for humans to save themselves in a chaotic world. Sparta didn't ask you to be gentle. They asked you to stand firm. And sometimes, in any era, beauty is simply not falling down. You might quietly understand that feeling, wanting silence, wanting strength, and wanting to be beautiful without anyone noticing you tried. Here, beauty isn't gentle. It's solid, cold, and carved through a lifetime of discipline. You've just left Sparta, where beauty meant blood and muscle. Now welcome to ancient Rome, where beauty was sociology. Here, beauty didn't help you survive. It helped you climb the social ladder. Your appearance didn't just turn heads. It could make people kneel or get banished from the dinner party. Start with lipstick, but not the kind you think. Roman women used cinnabar, a mercury ore, to paint their lips red. The color looked great, until your lips started blistering, going numb, and possibly dying early. But as long as the first impression was good, Who cared if you'd still be alive next year? Face cream? It was lead. To get that noble white skin, they applied cream made with white lead, applied daily, washed with donkey milk. And don't think they did it themselves. Roman noblewomen had at least 2 slaves just for beauty. One mixed lipstick, the other applied cream and gave facial massages. Every lipstick shade, every dab of cream had to match her mood, get the tone wrong or smear unevenly, and the slave got beaten, no questions asked. And for face masks, crushed mouse ashes mixed with almond oil. You use AHA. They used neurotoxins. The result? Extremely smooth skin, because it no longer knew how to resist. White teeth, drink urine. Rome had a saying, a white smile is a noble soul. Sounds classy, until you find out they brushed with fermented urine. No joke. Spanish urine was considered the best, because Spaniards ate lots of grapes, higher acid, better for removing stains. You use baking soda. They used what used to be banned for kids under 13. Beauty for whom? For what? Beauty in Rome didn't come from self-respect. It came from the gazes you wanted to control. Prostitutes had to wear blonde wigs, so everyone knew who they were. But if she served the emperor, she was allowed to wear amber-blended perfume, the kind only nobles used. Even fragrance had a class system. The rich wore Syrian rose oil and Arabian resin. The poor, if they wanted to smell nice, had to mix vinegar with orange peel or wood ash. Your scent entered the room before you did, and sometimes decided whether you got wine or the door. You wear Chanel. They wore social status on their wrists. And men, not just makeup, they wrapped themselves in sculpting fabric. Women bound their chests with linen to appear modest, while men used leather belts to flatten their stomachs and broaden their shoulders. Each layer said, I control myself. You wear a corset for fashion. They wore it to survive the gaze of power. Many young men learned to apply lipstick, curl their hair, and wear semi-transparent tunics just to catch the eye of powerful senators. No one said it out loud, but beauty was currency, sometimes worth more than gold. And the poor, they had to be beautiful too. No mercury lipstick, they used red earth. No lead cream, they mixed stove ash with sesame oil. Some chewed grapes and spat them out, hoping their lips would pinken just a little. Because sometimes just looking less pale was enough to be pitied, enough to get a scrap of leftover bread. Beauty didn't make them rich, but sometimes it kept them from starving. You look in the mirror, checking moles, sunspots, or that one hair poking from your nape. Just like a Roman girl in front of a bronze mirror, wondering whether to pick lead or mercury today, because both were too expensive. Beauty in Rome didn't come from instinct or faith. It came from a silent auction. Who's the most beautiful? Who survives the longest? Who gets remembered? As a legend in purple robes, smiling with urine-polished teeth. If in Rome, beauty was a public auction, then in ancient China, it was a handwritten letter in pale ink that you weren't allowed to reply to. You're stepping into the Han Dynasty's inner palace, but not everyone was allowed a mirror. Bronze mirrors, luxury items, were for those with names in the record books. As for maids, servants, they saw their reflections in wash basins. On a lucky day, a bronze mirror opened for you. That meant you had a place, or were about to become a pawn in a game no one explains. The air was thick with sandalwood and silence. A tilted head could be a love confession. A slow glance could be a challenge. Here, beauty wasn't for attention. It was designed to avoid reaction, like how you breathe, very softly, in a room where you're unsure if you're allowed to exist. Ideal skin, white as porcelain, thin as wind, faint like it came from a past life. Powder ground from seashells, mixed with jasmine water. Each time applied, you sneezed, and that was a sign. You were becoming beautiful. Lips, the smaller the better. A red dot on white skin, as if you were about to refuse something very important. No full lips, no smiling with teeth. A beautiful smile, made no sound. Eyebrows were entire poems. In the Sui dynasty, thick, square brows like brush handles showed righteousness. By the Tang dynasty, crescent moon brows with heavy rouge showed passion. Come the Song dynasty, eyebrows drawn thin as rice grains, faint as whispers, for humility. One wrong brow for the wrong era was a poem banned by the censors. There were times eyebrows curved like flying geese. There were times they were drawn like willow twigs trembling in the breeze. And they always had to look sad. Eyebrows were never allowed to smile, even when you were favored. Not everyone lived in the palace. Out in the villages, women still made themselves beautiful, using what they had. Stove ash mixed with rice oil on their cheeks, crushed dry corn powder for the forehead. Some chewed rose petals, holding them in their mouths to tint their lips naturally. Not to seduce, just to keep a little dignity amid the mud and sweat. You wore silk, they wore silence. You like blush. Here, they patted turmeric powder on their cheeks to look like they'd just finished crying. Not to be beautiful, but to make someone want to save them or kill them before someone else could. And if you were a man, not much better. Officials were taught to walk lightly, speak softly, wear dark silk, no muscles, no noise. Male beauty meant smoothness, blur, invisibility. But there was one group even more invisible, the beautiful men of the palace, not eunuchs, not officials. They existed in the faintest layer of power, wearing sheer silk, jade hairpins, walking on toes, singing in genderless voices. No one remembered their names, but without them, banquets lacked charm, and power grew cold. You saw them as beautiful, but you weren't allowed to say it. In a society where everything was recorded, beauty was something silently understood. You didn't say you were beautiful. You made others feel rude for looking at you too long. You ever felt too plain to stand out? Here, plainness meant survival. Each feature was a silent mark written on your face to let others know. I'm not a threat, but don't forget me either. You've passed through China, where beauty is silence. Now you've arrived in HEIAN, the ancient capital of Japan, where beauty almost doesn't exist. Not in a bad way, but in the sense that the less there is, the farther, the blurrier, the more precious. First, they shaved off their real eyebrows, then redrew them with charcoal or ink higher up on the forehead to create a transcendent look. Not angry, not happy, just present, like a passing cloud. This is a beauty that doesn't require you to show emotion. It forces others to imagine what you might be feeling. A beautiful woman in HEIAN did not keep her teeth white. She dyed them black with a mixture of iron and vinegar called ohaguro. That black wasn't meant to scare. It meant she was married or had pledged loyalty to one person until death. Smiling was no longer an act of joy. It was a silent vow, etched into the teeth. Every kimono layer wasn't just for warmth. It sent messages. Pale red for spring, deep purple for grief, bright orange for longing. An observant person needed only to glance at the sleeve cuff to know if you were happy, mourning, or waiting for someone who wouldn't come. You didn't need to cry. Your collar was already sad for you. Noble women wore junihito, 12-layered kimono. No one saw their bodies. Beauty lay in how much of the collar showed, and whether the inner colors matched the season. If it was winter and you wore red underneath, you were burning. If it was spring and you let purple peek out, you were quietly sorrowful. Here, you didn't need to speak. The fabric spoke for you, but only to someone observant enough to read 2 fingers of collar width. HEIAN noblemen also wore white powder, painted brows, and silk robes down to the ankles. But they didn't compete. They didn't show off muscles. They wrote poetry, played the biwa, and moved without sound. Who was more beautiful? No one knew. They only met behind curtains, through strings of music, or by candlelight. A charming HEIAN man was one who sent the right poem, after a midnight rain. Beauty here didn't shout. It tapped someone on the shoulder, then disappeared. The longer the hair, the more noble. HEIAN women never cut their hair in their lives. They slept with hair coiled around them, brushing for hours with wooden combs. No one saw their faces clearly, but if the wind lifted their hair and you smelled incense, you'd know. This person belonged to the world of poetry, not the world of flesh. The HEIAN people didn't like bright light. They met under oil lamps or behind paper screens. Beauty wasn't seen. Beauty was imagined. You didn't know if someone was truly beautiful. You just knew, when they turned away, you felt a loss. Servants in the HEIAN court brushed hair, arranged kimono layers, and dyed teeth for the nobles. They memorized seasonal color rules and knew exactly how much sleeve to reveal. But they weren't allowed to wear bright kimono, apply lipstick, or own mirrors. Beauty was their duty, not their dream. HEIAN beauty wasn't shouted, it was whispered through poetry. A poem only 5 lines long, but it could stir someone for life. I saw cherry blossoms fall in the courtyard and remembered a face I never saw clearly. HEIAN people didn't say, "You're beautiful." They wrote, "If dew gathers on the leaf, it might resemble your gaze." You apply lipstick, curl lashes, and find the right selfie light. They layered pale white powder thick, hid behind curtains, and simply stayed silent at the right time. No one was the most beautiful in HEIAN. There was only the one remembered longest in a poem, because they dropped a handkerchief at just the right moment when cherry blossoms began to fall. You've passed blackened teeth and collars that whispered farewell. Now turn your gaze, no, tilt it, toward Central America, where the ancient Maya believed the gods don't answer the call of the ugly. Teeth, your divine resume. Jewelry in Maya culture wasn't just for beauty, it was proof of survival. Every jade stud in your tooth, every seashell earring told a story. You couldn't wear it without passing a ritual. You couldn't keep it without enduring pain. You didn't wear adornments. You survived to be worthy of them. The Maya filed teeth into V or T shapes. Sometimes drilled small holes into their canines to inlay jade, quartz, or seashells. This wasn't for seduction. It was to prove you were brave enough, connected enough, and possessed the metaphysical quality. You smiled. The gods saw you. You suffered. The gods knew you were worthy. Eyes, the beauty of disalignment. From infancy, noble children had weights placed near their eyes to force the eyes to turn inward, because to the Maya, crossed eyes were a sign of being chosen. Crossed eyes meant a gaze caught between two worlds, able to see both the human realm and the divine. Worried you don't look straight at the camera. Here, that was a sign of divine destiny. Foreheads flattened into perfection. The ideal forehead in Maya culture was sloped and flat, like a temple wall. Infants had their heads bound between two wooden boards for days to gradually flatten the forehead. Beauty through pain. Beauty was being reshaped into the image of the cosmos. The body. If you weren't colored, you got tattooed. The Maya tattooed using stingray spines, fish bones, or cactus thorns. Not just arms and legs, but faces, stomachs, even eyelids. Each tattoo was a story of ancestors, a prayer to the heavens. But getting inked wasn't the end. The body would be cleansed, with ashes from a temple or the dead, mixed with holy water. Not just to soothe the wounds, but to let ancestral spirits soak into the newly marked skin. You wear designer labels? They etched entire family trees onto their ribcage, then bathed it in the ghosts of those who came before. Commoners, priests, different beauty rules. Beauty didn't look the same across social classes. Commoners beautified to receive blessings, to be recognized by their community. Priests, they beautified to become part of the ceremony, to erase the self and merge into the form of gods. They might slash their faces, pierce their tongues with fish spines, and sing while blood dripped from their gums, as the sincerest prayer the body could offer. Blood was the ultimate symbol of Maya beauty. Not diamonds, not perfume. Blood was what the gods wanted to see. There were festivals where the most beautiful person was the one who bled the most and didn't fall. Bleeding wasn't damage. It was commitment, sacrifice, and beauty. In Maya culture, blood wasn't gross. Blood was light. Beauty wasn't for the faint of heart. It wasn't just aesthetics. It was a message sent to the gods through body, blood, and endurance. You're fixing your hair. They were banging their foreheads against stone, filing their teeth until they bled, believing each pain was a knock on the door of the universe. If you've ever thought, I need to be pretty to be loved, then to the Maya, I must be beautiful to be accepted among invisible forces. You've just stepped out of the sacred forests of the Maya, where beauty meant blood and gemstones. Now, you're standing at the doorstep of an ancient Hindu temple, where beauty is a whispered offering. Skin, a turmeric canvas. In ancient India, beautiful skin didn't need to be pale. It needed the golden hue of fresh turmeric and early sunlight. Each morning, women would rub turmeric, milk, and red clay onto their faces, not just for beauty, but to ward off negative energy and greet the universe. You put on makeup to go out. They did it to step out of samsara. Henna, unspoken art. Before weddings, women's hands were covered in henna, not to show off, but to speak to Vishnu, to their future husbands, to themselves, that they were ready for a new lifetime. A spiral meant blessing. A lotus meant a soul's invitation. The darker the dye, the stronger the bond. And if the henna hadn't faded yet, the bride didn't have to do chores. You want beauty? Start by not washing your hands. Hair, and the question, who may touch it? Not just women. Men in ancient India had their own beauty rituals. Before entering temples, they'd anoint themselves with oils made of lemon blossom and Ganges river sand. Hair was combed with silk cloth, tied with a red band, like a silent garland around meditation. Beards weren't shaved clean, but trimmed into Bodhi leaf shapes. They weren't beautiful to conquer. They were beautiful to be forgiven. Long, shiny black hair was seen as power and spirit. A wife's hair was touched by her husband during prayer. A maiden's hair was braided like a coiling dragon, like a mark of betrothal. And when a woman offered her hair to the temple, it wasn't a sacrifice. It was a transaction with the gods. I offer hair, please lift the curse. Fragrance, not a scent, but an aura. Beauty here wasn't just in skin or hands or eyes. It was in the scent you left behind as you passed. Every beautiful person was a burning stick of incense. Jasmine, sandalwood, warm myrrh. Not to seduce, but to remind someone was here and existed rightly. Temple beauty versus street beauty. In the temple, beauty was humility. A beautiful woman moved quietly. Her skirts kissed the floor. Her hands wore no clinking bangles. Incense instead of perfume. Eyes lowered to earth. On the streets, beauty was silver ankle chains, red lips, bold eyeliner, and earrings dancing as you hurried through the market alley. A beautiful person knew where they were and looked beautiful according to the air of that place. The gods needed stillness, the street needed rhythm, and you needed to know what signal you were sending. Beauty as a prayer. You didn't need to sparkle. You only needed to be pure, consistent, and intentional. In ancient India, beauty wasn't for gazing. It was a signal to higher spiritual planes. You put on lipstick. They didn't just apply, they wore karma. Silver ankle chains marked marriage. Waistbands of jade for fertility prayers. Nose rings for puberty. Layered necklaces corresponded to vows made in one's life. You think you're wearing jewelry. In ancient India, you're carrying sacred commitments, one by one. They wore lip color made from Ganges river soil and told each other, every smile must catch a god's glance. You chose the right outfit. They chose sari, not just for beauty, but because each color was a message to fate. Red sari, for weddings and vitality. White sari, for widows, no makeup, no bangles. Turmeric yellow, for new beginnings, purification, or luck. In ancient India, the color you wore might decide whether you were still allowed to smile. They wore red sari, not for beauty, but because it was Shiva's color in weddings. You've crossed the river soil of the Ganges, past silver ankle chains. Now you're in the Sahel plain, where beauty doesn't lie on the skin, but in the cut. Scars, not wounds, but tribal records. In many parts of ancient Africa like Yoruba, Nuba, or Dinka, scars weren't something to hide. Scars were surnames, identity cards, roots. Small cuts on cheeks, foreheads, bellies, made with heated daggers. When you were old enough to bear pain, and important enough to carry a bloodline worth remembering. You carry the surname Nguyen. They carried mountain patterns on their cheeks, from where their ancestors came. Skin patterns, time carved into flesh. Each scar, once healed, would rise like a verse etched into skin. Some marked adulthood. Some said you were a mother, a warrior's wife, or a survivor of an epidemic. They didn't use diaries. They wore history on their chests. But not every scar was art. Some were ritual. Others came from punishment, slavery, or cultural erasure. The same cut could be honor or imprisonment. Not every scar was voluntary, but every scar told a story. Each scar, once healed, would rise like a verse etched into skin. They didn't use diaries. They wore history on their chests. The head, not to die, but to braid history. Every hairstyle in ancient Africa was a living map. Hair wasn't just for looks, but to say who you were, your tribe, lineage, and community role. Hair was braided, wrapped, twisted, woven, following memory, not fashion. A lost child could be returned just by the braid pattern. Among them, Fulani braids were iconic. 2 tight rows hugging the temples, hair threaded with metal beads, shells, wooden pieces. Each item a signal: eldest daughter, soon to be bride, or temple guardian heir. No need to speak. Your head spoke first. Natural pigments from mud, leaves, and insects. Beauty didn't need lipstick, it needed earth. Women used red mud, indigo powder, crushed insect dust, smearing on hair, skin, even jewelry, to ward off evil spirits and UV rays. Beauty here was both a spiritual armor and homemade sunscreen passed from mother to daughter. But not just color, they beautified with scent. Each tribe had its own mix: burned bark smoke, wild animal grease, herbal ash essence. Not to seduce, but to be remembered. A girl's scent might say she's mourning, betrothed, or bound by a vow. You walk past them, and in the air feel an untold ritual. The beauty of mourning and surviving warriors. Not all beauty was for the living. In many tribes, some hairstyles were only done when mourning, like uncombed hair, clay-smeared heads, or shaving half the skull. A glance at the hair told you they were grieving, no words needed. On the other hand, a warrior who survived battle earned a new scar, a new chapter carved on the body. A living record, no ink needed, just dried blood and a body still standing. Ancient Africa didn't have much writing, but they had bodies that told stories. Your chest was swollen because you gave birth. Your shoulders were bruised because you passed the rite of adulthood. Your face had 3 diagonal cuts because you carry the X bloodline and you crossed death to live today. On the beautiful history of France, from Clovis to Napoleon. In the year 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire, the supreme symbol of order, law, and power for 5 centuries, collapsed. Not with a bang, but with a sigh. A barbarian leader named Odoacer deposed Emperor Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial crown back to Constantinople, like returning an invisible debt. There was no national funeral, no farewell song, only the silence of abandoned stone roads and military camps with no masters. In the land the Romans called Gallia, today's France, it meant a storm was coming. Aqueducts stopped flowing, forums turned into desolate flea markets. Stones from ancient temples were stripped by locals, rebuilt into house walls or pigsties. Heated baths, once a symbol of civilization, became rainwater tanks for entire villages. Cities decayed, markets emptied, bridges cracked. Those who had once been Roman citizens were now farmers lurking in forests, peeking out from ruins like rats beneath the crumbled walls of an ancient library. No map called this place France. There was no nation, only a land torn like old cloth, pulled this way by the Visigoths, ripped that way by the Burgundians, and pushed deeper each day by Frankish warriors from the north. In that setting, every known order was erased. No more Roman citizenship, no more governors, no more protection of the legions. The roads once walked by Caesar were now pierced by roots. Arenas once roaring with glory now echoed only with weeds and owl cries. Yet amid the ruin, a few fragments still clung to Rome's shadow. Some cities, like Soissons, maintained Roman-style administration under local generals. In the south, the Gallo-Romans preserved Latin and the Christian Church. But no one truly believed the empire would return. These were crumbling oases in a desert of chaos. The only thing that remained was memory. the memory of an empire that once brought leather shoes, sun calendars, and heated baths to the people here. But worse than poverty was the sense of dislocation. People no longer knew where they belonged. They had once been Roman citizens, but Rome was dead. They were not Franks nor Visigoths. They were only those who survived. In remote villages, old beliefs returned. People made offerings to river gods, hung stone charms, prayed for rain with Celtic ancestral rituals. Meanwhile, isolated monasteries still echoed with Latin prayers, the last whispers of a collapsed order. But memory cannot be eaten. Memory cannot shield you from the Frank's axe or the Gothic knight's spear. That land needed a new name. But to have a name, someone had to name it first, and that person had yet to appear. At that moment, all of Gallia was a drifting plank on the sea, with no one at the helm. But from within the grey smoke and dried blood, a 15-year-old barbarian was sharpening his sword. He would not ask permission to become king. In the year 481, a Frankish tribal leader rose to power at the age of 15. His name was Clovis. No one then called him King of France, because that concept didn't exist yet. But history would later see him as the first to lay the foundation stone of France. The Franks were a northern Germanic tribe, barbaric, agile, warlike. They lived scattered in small groups, with no capital, no written laws, and plunder as the only rule. A Frankish leader only held credibility if he won enough treasure to share with his followers. All decisions were based on brute force. Before Clovis, the Franks followed the custom of Vergild, meaning murder didn't necessarily lead to death. Just enough gold paid would settle it. The justice system had no courts, just councils of warriors. The weak had no laws to protect them, only prayers to be left alone. Clovis grew up in that world, but he would be the first to change it from within. Clovis was born into an era where strength was measured by how many men you could cut down, not how many laws you could proclaim. And Clovis, somehow, was good at both. In 486, Clovis marched his army to Soissons, the last stronghold still holding onto the Roman model, ruled by General Syagrius. Syagrius wasn't a Germanic lord, but the last Roman in Gaul to uphold the old administration and military system, a ghost left behind by the empire. The clash between Clovis and Syagrius wasn't just a battle, but a symbolic event, the final blow to Roman power in Western Europe. Syagrius lost and fled to the Visigothic kingdom, former allies, but the Visigoth king handed him over to Clovis, as if the Germanic tribes themselves were closing the final door on the old era. When Clovis won, he didn't just take the city, he seized the last symbol of Rome's power in Gaul. Among the spoils, Clovis's men found a delicate ivory comb, stored in a church. In Roman culture, ivory combs were luxury items, owned by nobles or high clergy. They weren't just for hair, they symbolized elegance, authority, and dignity. One soldier kept the comb as his personal prize. When Clovis heard, he killed him on the spot, in front of the ranks. Not out of piety, not for military discipline, but for something simpler. Everything from victory belonged to the king. The ivory comb, small, soft, luxurious, became the first symbol of the absolute power of the first Frankish king. A tool for grooming, turned into a declaration of royal authority. No one keeps what belongs to Clovis. After that victory, Clovis kept expanding his territory, defeating the Thuringians, pushing back the Burgundians, splitting the Visigoths in the south. But Clovis's sharpness wasn't just in the sword, it was in a softer weapon, Christianity. Clovis's wife, Princess Clotilde, was a Christian. Clovis himself followed the Germanic pagan faith. But in the year 496, during the Battle of Tolbiac, when the Franks were about to fall to the Alemanni, Clovis prayed, not to the old gods, but to his wife's god, and he won. Right after the battle, Clovis was baptized, becoming the first Christian king among Germanic leaders. This marked a major political turning point. While most contemporary Germanic kings, like the Visigoths or Ostrogoths, followed Arianism, a Christian sect deemed heretical by the Church, Clovis chose to side with Rome. It was a bold and strategic move. With that act, Clovis became the Church's only legitimate partner in the West, while Byzantium was too distant, and the Arians were untrustworthy. The Pope, Gallic bishops, and Gallo-Romans saw Clovis as a new Constantine, a barbarian chosen by God to restore order. More than 3,000 Frankish warriors followed him, one by one stepping into mass baptism, as if the entire tribe was reborn politically. Clovis was not just a king, he was God's chosen king, in the eyes of the Church and his people. From then on, Frankish kingship became inseparable from divine will, a principle that would define France for the next 1,000 years. At age 30, Clovis had achieved the nearly impossible, unifying most of Gaul under a single crown, ending Roman influence and paving the way for a new identity. When Clovis died in the year 511, he left the kingdom to his 4 sons, as per old Germanic custom. Each ruled a region: Theodoric I in Metz, Clodomir in Orléans, Childebert I in Paris, and Clotaire I in Soissons. This division, seemingly reasonable, began a long period of civil war. In the following decades, Clovis's heirs would kill one another for power. There were horrifying cases, like Clotaire and Childebert conspiring to kill their 2 nephews, sons of their late brother, just to seize inherited lands. This German-style succession system, based on equal division rather than centralized inheritance, would fracture the Frankish kingdom into pieces. And from those pieces, medieval France would have to begin again. A decision that would lead to bloody centuries. But at that moment, the seed of France had been sown. Under the blade, the baptismal water, and a blood-stained ivory comb. In the winter of the year 496, a Frankish army fell into despair. It was the Battle of Tolbiac, where Clovis faced off against the Alemanni, warriors from the deep eastern forests, disciplined and fierce like wolves. The battle was far from easy. The Frankish lines were broken, many generals killed. Clovis, the newly crowned king of a barbarian people with little experience in long-term command, had to face a question few warriors of the time dared to ask. When all gods are silent, who do you pray to? In the chaos, Clovis turned to a god he had never believed in, the god of Clotilde, his Catholic wife. Not Wotan, not Donar, not the northern forest gods, but the god of Rome, the very god mocked by Frankish warriors as the weakling nailed to a cross. Clovis vowed, if he won, he would abandon the old gods and be baptized into the Christian faith. The Franks counterattacked, the Alemanni were routed. Clovis survived and kept his promise. Baptism, a political decision in the garb of faith. According to traditional records, Clovis's baptism took place at the Church of Reims, led by Bishop Remigius. It was not merely a religious rite, but a symbolic display of power. Clovis wore a white robe, knelt before the altar. Holy water was poured over his head, and sacred oil anointed his forehead, marking him as a holy king. According to legend, the holy oil, Saint-Ampoule, used to anoint him did not come from human hands, but was brought down from heaven by a dove, symbol of the Holy Spirit. From then on, Clovis was not merely seen as converted, but as divinely anointed, like the ancient prophets of Israel. That baptism became the model for future French kings. All would be anointed at Reims, as if directly inheriting from Clovis, the first. Shortly after, in the city of Reims, Clovis knelt before Bishop Remigius. Holy water was poured over his head, not just to wash away sin, but to mark a geopolitical turning point in Europe. Clovis did not just change his faith, he changed alliances, changed power, and changed the language of kingship. Over 3,000 Frankish warriors were baptized with him in a collective rite, an unprecedented event in history. A barbarian tribe transformed in mere months, not by reform, but by a handshake between victory and doctrine. Unlike Visigoth or Ostrogoth kings, who followed the Arian heresy, Clovis accepted Orthodox doctrine, directly allying with the Roman Church. At the time, nearly all Germanic kings ruling Europe, from Spain to Italy, followed Arian Christianity, a branch condemned as heresy by the Nicene Council. This put them in silent conflict with the Orthodox Church. Thus, Clovis's conversion to Orthodoxy was a strategic pivot. He didn't just enter faith, he entered a monopoly, becoming the only king in the West the Church could openly support. From then on, Clovis's image was elevated, no longer merely a Frank, but a new Constantine for the post-Roman world. The Church has a king, and the king has a saint. From that moment, Clovis was no longer a Germanic tribal chief. He became a protector of the faith, supported by the bishops of Gaul, accepted by the Gallo-Roman people, who once hated the Franks, as a new emperor. French history had begun a new orbit. Every time the throne trembled, the church would steady it, and every time faith was in doubt, the crown would uphold it. Clovis built institutions, enacted the Salic law, the first written law code of the Franks. It was written in Latin mixed with Germanic, recording procedures for resolving disputes, property, marriage, and compensation. Not merely a legal document, the Salic law was the first step in transforming the Franks from a band of warriors into a governable community. Its content was simple, rough, but practical. Whoever stole bees must pay silver. Whoever broke another's tooth must pay a specific number of coins. In a world where all conflicts had been settled by blood and revenge, assigning value to a tooth or a bee was the first step toward the state. He merged what remained of Roman order, Latin language, tax systems, churches, fortresses. Step by step, a primitive nation took shape, soaked in blood, scented with incense. Faith or strategy. Clovis is often called the Constantine of the West. Aigi, both converted after decisive battles, and both knew how to wield religion to restore power. But whereas Constantine acted while the empire still stood, Clovis did so amid the ashes of a fallen world. Compared to the pantheon of Rome, where Constantine ascended to the throne, Reims was merely a small church in a cold forest. Yet there, a new model was formed, a king anointed by the Holy Spirit, a symbol that would define coronation rituals for all of medieval Europe. Did Clovis truly believe in God? Maybe, maybe not. But what's certain is, he believed in the power of a state needing an ideal to survive. And in the 5th century Europe, no ideal was stronger than the cross. Clovis died in the year 511, after 3 decades building an unprecedented kingdom. But the legacy he left, like an unpolished gem, was immediately split apart. According to Germanic custom, royal power did not belong to one son, but was equally divided among all sons. In the old Germanic world, a kingdom was not a nation in the Roman sense, but the personal property of its ruler. To them, land, people, fortresses were inheritance, like farmland or livestock. Unlike the Roman view of the emperor as embodiment of the empire, Frankish kings saw kingship as a dowry of sword and blood, not a sacred duty, but a right to own and divide. For Clovis, this meant the Frankish kingdom was split into 4 parts, each under one son. Theuderic I ruled Metz, the mineral-rich eastern land. Clodomir took Orléans, the heart of the Loire River. Childebert I held Paris, the future capital region. Clotaire I governed Soissons, the symbolic home of the first victory. At first glance it seemed fair, but in reality it was an open invitation to endless conflict. Brothers, blood, and the throne. In the 20 years following Clovis's death, his sons constantly allied, betrayed, and destroyed each other. Succession was no longer a bloodline, but a cold political game. When Clodomir died in a war in Burgundy, Clotaire and Childebert, his brothers, not only divided his land, but plotted to kill his sons to eliminate rival claimants. According to Frankish records, they sent for the 3 boys, sons of Clodomir, to be brought to court and asked their grandmother to choose: either have their heads shaved and sent to a monastery, or let them die as potential kings. She stayed silent. 2 of the 3 were executed right there in the palace, like a reverse coronation. Blood instead of crowns, silence instead of justice. The 3 boys, sons of Clodomir, were summoned. 2 were killed. The last was sent to a monastery, living as a shadow of the throne he should have inherited. This was no longer a family story, but the opening chapter of France's medieval tradition of blood and power. A kingdom without a centre. The map of the Frankish kingdom after Clovis looked like a shattered mirror. Each shard had its own capital, army, laws, yet all claimed to be heirs of Clovis. No centre, no capital, only mini-dynasties acting as independent kingdoms, ruled by kings who were both brothers and enemies. Local bishops and nobles gradually gained more power, acting as mediators between factions. In a context of no fixed capital and weak central authority, bishops of major cities like Tours, Reims, or Arles became not just spiritual leaders, but shadow governors, controlling taxes, laws, and even local armies. The kings were hostile to each other, but each church acted like an embassy, a place where letters, seals, and sacred curses held weight equal to swords on the battlefield. But they too began to realize this fragmentation opened the door to indirect rule. When kings are weak, nobles grow strong, and France entered an age of fragile alliances between sword, spear, and bishop. Legacy of division. Though the kingdom was divided, one thing remained, and even grew more sacred: the title Rex Francorum, King of the Franks. This title no longer represented a specific land, but became a symbol of legitimacy. Anyone who held it had reason to claim unity. Each king, no matter how small, declared himself the sole heir of Clovis. They built churches, minted coins, crowned themselves, and engraved on every item the name, Rex Francorum. That title survived not because of stability, but because of division. When no one was strong enough to seize the crown alone, power became an invisible cloak. Anyone could wear it, but no one dared rip it from another's hands. Ironically, Clovis had united a land that never had a name, but his successors turned it into a war map. Yet in all that rubble and betrayal, one thing endured: the title Rex Francorum, King of the Franks. It belonged to no one, but was always passed on, a kind of phantom power hovering over every lord. Clovis was dead, but his shadow still claimed a share in every patch of land, every executive decision, every palace assassination. In the year 732, on a cold plain near Tours, France, or more accurately, the Frankish kingdom, nearly vanished from the map of Europe. A mighty Muslim army from the south, led by General Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, had crossed the Pyrenees, not as a raid, but as a spearhead of the Umayyad Empire's expansion. At that time, the Umayyads were one of the two greatest powers in the world, controlling the Middle East, North Africa, and the entire Iberian Peninsula. Their northern ambition was clear: through Aquitaine, across the Loire River, straight into northern Europe. They had taken Bordeaux, ravaged Poitiers, and were now only a few days' march from Tours. To Europeans at the time, this was no longer a raid. It was the end of a world. And then, from the shadows of history, Charles Martel stepped forth. Not a king, no crown, but absolute power. Charles, the Hammer of God. Charles was the illegitimate son of Pepin of Herstal, an heir to the Merovingian legacy without the Merovingian name. With no formal title, Charles held a modest-sounding position: mayor of the palace, like a prime minister of the Frankish kingdom. But when Merovingian kings were nothing more than long-haired heads in ox carts, Charles gave the orders, collected taxes, trained the army, and decided when the king should speak. They called him Martel, meaning the hammer. Not because he was hard, but because he knew when and where to strike. The Battle of Tours, where Islam halted. The Muslim army had already taken the entire Iberian Peninsula. Their speed overwhelmed the small kingdoms, but Charles didn't flee. He gathered his forces, mostly infantry, and hid in the forest, firmly defending. When the Muslim forces arrived, expecting their usual sweeping victory, they encountered a wall of silent Frankish men. Charles arranged his infantry in tight blocks, no spreading out, no movement, just standing there like a living wall. This clashed completely with the Umayyad fighting style: swift attacks, fast retreats, reliant on light cavalry. Martel didn't risk a counterattack. He hid his troops in the woods, using the cold, dense terrain that disadvantaged cavalry. For hours, the Franks only defended, not even panting, letting the enemy touch the wall and shatter themselves. No noise, no rash counterattacks, just the silence of a forest full of swords. The battle lasted all day. Abdul Rahman was killed while trying to break the Frankish lines. The Muslim army, leaderless, unfamiliar with the terrain, retreated overnight, leaving behind their camp, loot, and the dream of conquering Europe. One victory, many legends. After the Battle of Tours, Charles Martel was endlessly praised. To the church, he wasn't just a general. He was defensor fidei, defender of the faith. Later, chroniclers saw his victory as a milestone of Western civilization, the day Islam stopped and Christianity was saved. However, many modern historians question, was this truly a religious war? In truth, Charles had seized church property to fund his wars. He wasn't devout, didn't take orders from the Pope, nor fought for the cross. Charles protected the church, but never knelt to it. He fought not for faith, but for the survival of the emerging feudal structure. Tours wasn't the Holy Land, but it was where Charles Martel redrew the power map of Europe. The Battle of Tours wasn't just a military win. It became a symbol of Western civilization standing firm against the Islamic tide. The church called Charles Defensor Fidei, defender of the faith. Later, historians viewed him as the bulwark against Islam, the savior of Christian culture from extinction. But the truth is more complex. Charles didn't fight for religion. He fought for balance of power, to defend feudal property, and because he knew, if he lost, no one would call him the man who wields the sword for the king. Money, soldiers, and legacy. The victory at Tours didn't just boost Charles's fame, it changed the military model of Europe. Realizing the importance of a standing army, he began forming the first centralized Frankish military force, no longer dependent on local nobles. But armies need money, and Charles took it from the most unexpected source, the church. He seized lands, occupied wealthy monasteries, cut off bishops' revenues to fund the army. This made him unpopular with many clergy, but gave him total control during an era when Merovingian kings were merely symbolic. In Charles's hands, the sword was forged from holy ground, and this paradox laid the groundwork for a new dynasty. After the battle, Charles began building a professional army, the first in Frankish history not reliant on local nobles. To fund it, he took church land. Paradox, yes, but it was the beginning of a new reign. He didn't become king, but he fathered kings. Charles left no throne, but left a legacy spanning 3 generations. From him, a political bloodline was reforged. He sharpened the sword for his son Pepin the Short to ascend the throne. He paved the way for the Pope to crown his descendants. And he, through victory at Tours, made Europe distinguish between military leader and king of God. A man without a crown, yet quietly forged the mightiest crown in European history. His son, Pepin the Short, would become the first Carolingian king, and his grandson, a child with a broad forehead, booming voice, and boundless ambition, was none other than Charlemagne. On December 25th, in the year 800, in the solemn stillness of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, an event occurred, both grand and theatrical. A tall man, thick-bearded, wearing a white cloak, was praying when Pope Leo III approached and placed a crown on his head amidst chants and pealing bells. It wasn't a coincidence. Leo III had been assaulted, blinded, and accused of blasphemy by Roman nobles, and had to flee north, seeking Charlemagne's protection. That crown was more than ceremony. It was a political debt, a solid shield exchanged for a sacred symbol. He turned, astonished, but it was too late. He had just become Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. His name was Karl the Grosser, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. The throne wasn't his choice, but Europe willed it. Charlemagne didn't ask for the crown, or at least, that's what he said. Had I known what the Pope was planning, I wouldn't have entered the church that day. That statement was both true and false. True, because he didn't want to be beholden to the Pope. False, because all of Europe knew, if anyone deserved to succeed Rome, it was him. The man who had united nearly all of Western Europe, from the Elbe River to the Pyrenees. An empire built by sword and maintained by church. During over 40 years of rule, Charlemagne led more than 50 military campaigns, conquering the Saxons, Lombards, Avars, and even Muslims in Spain. But he was more than a warrior. He built monasteries, established schools, and launched one of the greatest intellectual movements of the Middle Ages, the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne invited scholars from England, Ireland, and Italy, notably Alcuin of York, to his court to write textbooks, copy the Bible, and standardize education. He demanded monasteries have libraries, bishops know Latin, and all documents be written uniformly. While Europe fell into darkness, Charlemagne lit the lamps, not in a palace, but in the chapel. He summoned scholars, issued laws, and insisted every priest be literate, unheard of at the time. To Charlemagne, a crucifix and a Latin book had power equal to an army. Roman emperor, but not in Rome. Charlemagne's crown didn't come from the people, but from the Pope. Rome had no emperor. Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, was too far and powerless to protect the Pope from Italian lords. Charlemagne, a Frank from the north, was the perfect choice, with troops, faith, and prestige. And so, a new concept was born. The Holy Roman Empire, not in Rome, not speaking full Latin, not of Caesar's bloodline, but a new form of Western Christian kingship. However, the coronation of 800 set a lasting precedent. The right to crown kings now lay with the Pope, not God or the people. From then on, for centuries, Charlemagne's successors would battle the Vatican over who truly chose the king, who gave power, and who was merely a puppet draped in robes, a crown placed on Charlemagne's head, but also an invisible chain between throne and altar. Law, scholarship, and script, how Charlemagne controlled his era. To rule a vast territory, Charlemagne had to standardize everything, from measurement units and taxation to handwriting. He ordered the creation of Carolingian minuscule, the precursor to modern Latin script, making documents more readable. He established church schools, where monks and princes alike learned Latin and mathematics under one curriculum. Not crown nor sword, but language and knowledge upheld his empire. A lonely death and an eternal resurrection. Charlemagne died in 814 at Aachen, the city he built as his dream capital. No grand funeral, no instant monuments, but his body was laid in the cathedral crypt, among candles and hymns, as if his whole life had prepared for that moment. After his death, his empire would fracture. Sons, grandsons, great-grandsons would divide power, leading to endless wars. But the name Charlemagne would live on. In French, the dynasty founder. In German, Karl der Grosse, a symbol of strength. In Latin, Carolus Magnus, father of scholarly civilization. And in European history, the man who turned church and crown into the two pillars of the next millennium. In 814, Charlemagne died in Aachen. His vast empire fell into the hands of his son, Louis the Pious, a devout, kind-hearted king, and ill-suited to the art of ruling with a sword. Just one generation later, what Charlemagne had built with steel, blood, and hymns began to crack from within. Louis the Pious, the successor, had faith, but lacked his father's iron hand. He often yielded to nobles, was manipulated by his sons, and most crucially, didn't dare choose a sole heir. For Louis and the Carolingian princes, the empire was no longer a sacred mission, but property to be divided, like land, horses, or swords in a will. They inherited the throne, but not the idea of unity. By 843, the crack became a border, the Treaty of Verdun. A new map was drawn, dividing the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts, laying the foundation for 3 future European nations. the Treaty of Verdun, dividing power like land. After Louis's death, his three sons, Lothair, Charles the Bald, and Louis the German, plunged into a succession war lasting over a decade. Lothair, as the eldest and holder of the title Roman Emperor granted by their father, wanted to keep the whole empire. The two younger brothers disagreed, allied, and defeated him at the Battle of Fontenoy in 841, one of the bloodiest civil wars of the medieval era. In the 2 years that followed, the brothers kept switching sides, sending peace letters, then drawing swords again. No one won outright. Only the land was ravaged and the people exhausted. The Treaty of Verdun wasn't signed for peace, but from exhaustion. It didn't end war, just nodded to the reality that none could destroy the others. So in 843, the three brothers sat down, not in peace, but in political fatigue. Lothair received the central strip, from northern Italy to the Netherlands, long but hard to govern, called Lotharingia. Louis got the east, the German-speaking lands beyond the Rhine. This would become the foundation of Germany. Charles took the west, future France, called Francia Occidentalis, a tripartite map, but also the cradle of three European nations. Not just geography changed, but culture began to diverge. The west spoke Roman languages toward future France. The east kept German, the seed of modern Germany. The center, Lotharingia, became a mixed zone, where language, law, and loyalty constantly clashed. The brothers divided land, but also pronunciation, faith, and the meaning of kingship. Lotharingia, the stateless child. Lothair's land, stretching from the North Sea to Rome, was vast and chaotic. No common language, no political center, no coherent identity. And so, it never became a lasting nation. Lotharingia would dissolve into pieces. One part went to France. One part became Lorraine. Later, the apple of discord between France and Germany. One part became the Habsburg heartland. It didn't die, but never truly lived. Lotharingia existed as a shadow in history. Germany, a nation without a king, but with regions. Louis the German's portion would gradually become Germany, though it took centuries to form. No fixed capital, no stable dynasty. Each region had its own duke, and each duke had his own laws. But from here emerged the idea of the Reich, an empire as a collection of principalities, sharing one sacred title, Holy Roman Emperor of the German people. It wasn't unified, but powerful in symbolism. And that symbol would last until the 19th century. France, from 1/3 to a whole idea. Charles the Bald ruled the western land, where Rome once tread, where Charlemagne was born, where monasteries grew like forests. This was the land most Romanized in culture. And it was here that a feudal regime would develop, royal power, and the French language. From 1/3 of a map, the idea of France began to sprout. The people spoke a variant of Roman, called Oil, ancestor of French. The nobles laid the groundwork for rigid feudalism. The church controlled education, society, and communication, shaping the French way of life. A broken map, but a history drawn. The borders set by the Treaty of Verdun weren't just geographical. They were political legacies lasting centuries. The Lorraine region, part of Lotharingia, would be a hotspot of Franco-German conflict for nearly 1,000 years. The concept of the Holy Roman Empire evolved from ceremonial title to a platform for the dream of European unity, though never realized. Above all, This marked the start of Europe's nationalization era, where kingship was no longer cosmic, but tied to language, territory, and practical power. Charlemagne dreamed of a unified empire, but his descendants inadvertently created three new forms, not empires, but nations. The Treaty of Verdun wasn't just a land deal, it was the beginning of Europe's political diversity. From the three shards of one empire came three personalities, three languages, three definitions of power. In 987, after generations of Carolingian kings ruling in chaos and rivalry, a new figure was elected King of France, Hugh Capet. Sounds grand, but the truth is a little sad. Hugh didn't ascend the throne with a majestic coronation like Charlemagne, nor did he conquer like Pepin, or get baptized like Clovis. He became king because no one disliked him enough to object. And upon taking the crown, the territory he actually controlled, known as Ile-de-France, was just a small area around Paris, barely the size of a modern-day province. Still, he bore the title Rex Francorum, King of the Franks, a title once tied to warriors who rode out and conquered thousands of miles, was now worn by a man whose kingdom could be traversed on foot. That title no longer represented military might. It became ceremonial clothing, a form of reverence sustained more by habit than by strength. A kingdom no larger than a stroll. In Hugh Capet's time, France wasn't a unified bloc, but a loose collection of feudal domains, each with its own laws, taxes, and soldiers. The Duchy of Normandy was wealthy and had its own navy. Burgundy operated like an independent state. Aquitaine was larger than the land Hugh ruled. Many nobles were richer and more powerful than the king. When Hugh sent emissaries to collect taxes or request troops, some lords shut their gates. He was King of France on paper, but in reality, more like the mayor of Paris with a red cloak. A king not by blood, but by contract. Hugh Capet was not a Carolingian. His lineage came from powerful nobility, with ancestors who had been counts of Paris. But notably, he was elected, not legally inherited. A council of bishops and nobles chose him because he was neutral, non-threatening. They thought he would be easy to control, and they were wrong. Hugh wasn't strong, but he knew how to wait. He knew how to document, and he knew how to protect his family name. What he really did, preserve his dynasty. Hugh Capet's smartest political move wasn't on the battlefield, but in the bedroom and at the dinner table. Immediately after becoming king, he had his son, Robert II, crowned while Hugh was still alive. This was a way to lock the throne, transforming an elective monarchy into a hereditary one. From that moment on, the Capetian line would occupy the throne for over 800 years, even though many of them weren't particularly remarkable. The quiet monument of modern kingship. Hugh Capet didn't build an empire, win a major battle, or get a heroic sculpture. But he laid the foundation for the idea of France as a continuous dynasty, a model of a centralized state gradually increasing in power, a cultural notion that the king is the rightful father, not a warrior who sees the crown. He ruled like a placeholder, so that his descendants could sit longer and deeper. From tiny Paris sprouted modern France. Under Hugh Capet, the kingdom was just a name. But from that name France began, not by the sword, but by a clear bloodline, the tacit acceptance of the nobility, and gradually the trust of the people. In the 10th and 11th centuries, while the Capetian kings clung to their thrones through rituals, outside Paris, Real France had splintered into hundreds of autonomous power fragments. This was not the France we imagine today. It was a map like shattered glass, where each shard had its own lord, bishop, and set of laws. Lords, landholders who didn't need a king. Lords, seigneurs, of the time, didn't need orders from Paris to rule. They collected taxes, opened markets, built fortresses, and declared war on neighbors, all without the king's permission. A lord might rule just a few hundred hectares, but lived like a miniature emperor. They maintained private armies of knights. They had their own laws, their own prisons, and could compel local peasants into labor. In Burgundy, some had never heard of Hugh Capet, even though he was supposedly king of all France. The church, the most powerful landowner in Europe. If lords held land by sword, the church held it by scripture and certificates of divine blessing. Monasteries like Cluny weren't just places of prayer, but power centers overseeing dozens of villages, forests and rivers. Bishops and abbots could declare neutrality in wars, and sometimes excommunicate lords. They controlled books, libraries, laws, and even the very notion of right and wrong. When King Hugh Capet sought influence, he didn't send soldiers. He sent seeds, offerings, and invitations to fast at monasteries. Every castle a kingdom, every church a universe. France back then was like a grand strategy game. There were roughly 300 to 400 independent political entities on the map. Each castle had its own army. Each church had its own legal code. Each marketplace paid taxes to a different master. Ordinary people didn't belong to France. They belonged to the lands of Lord A or Bishop B. Someone could live an entire life never hearing the king's name, but know well the lord who married 3 wives and still refused to build a bridge for the village. No constitution, just oaths and spears. 10th to 11th century France had no concept of a modern nation. Instead, power operated via feudal contracts. I hold your land, in exchange I send troops, unless you're too weak. Oaths of loyalty, but oaths could be broken if the next count was a jerk. Military might. No constitution was stronger than a fortified gate and armed guards. Each mini-nation existed not because of ideals, but because it had bricks, swords, and peasants. Who actually ruled France? Answer: no one completely, and everyone partially. The king had the title, but no power in the south. Lords held land, but needed blessings from bishops. Bishops had divine authority, but were under larger abbots. It was a time of overlapping orders, where a man could be a peasant, a soldier, a churchgoer, and servant to 3 different masters. France was flour at this stage, unmixed, unshaped, but full of ingredients. When Hugh Capet wore his crown amid noble silence, France was just a patch of land around Paris. 2 centuries later, his descendants controlled nearly the entire map, but not by peace. From a king no one noticed, the Capetian line gradually became the hand holding the comb, reordering France's map, reclaiming territories, and preparing for an unending war. The Capet dynasty forged into steel. The Capetians multiplied. They passed the crown through unbroken father-to-son succession for many generations. But beyond the crown, they also married into Normandy, Anjou, Burgundy, bought back lands through weddings and divine blessings, used the Pope to reinforce legitimacy. By the 13th century, French kings were kings in the full sense. They had standing armies. They ran a professional tax system. They issued laws from Paris. Royal power ceased to be ceremonial. It became a sword again. Centralization, from 300 lords to a few dozen. Over generations, especially under Philippe Auguste, kings gradually stripped local nobles of power. They built watchtowers, stationed troops in distant regions, coaxed or coerced independent knights to submit, started land registries and tax rolls, laying the foundation for a modern state. France shifted from a mosaic map to a spiderweb, with Paris at the center. The thorn across the Channel, the Kingdom of England. Since William the Conqueror's invasion, 1066, English kings held lands in France, especially Normandy and Aquitaine. This created a strange contradiction. The King of England was a vassal of the King of France on French soil, but a sovereign on English soil. When French kings tightened control, English kings saw it as encroachment. Thus, the two nations began viewing each other as ancient enemies, even though technically they were distant relatives. The king dies, and the throne is contested. In 1328, King Charles IV of France died without a male heir. The nobles' council chose Philip VI, a distant Capet, to ensure a Frenchman rules the French. But across the sea, Edward III, King of England, grandson of a French king, also claimed the throne. If I won't be king, I'll at least teach them a bloody lesson. The start of 116 years of war. And so, the 100 Years' War began. Not just over a crown, but due to Anglo-French cultural tensions, economic rivalry in Flanders, the nobility's longing for a return to the glory of warfare. France entered the war with a unified heart, but a body full of old scars. Territories had once been divided. Nobility remained powerful. The church was split by the Avignon papacy. A country that had just learned to walk was thrown into the fire. From Clovis's comb to Jeanne d'Arc's sword, France began with a comb splitting heads 3 ways. When Clovis divided lands among his sons, through centuries it reunited into a form, only to be tested by swords, flames, and an English claim to the throne. The war would last a century,